An Apache girl is tied to the tracks as a human sacrifice, until a nameless cowboy comes charging with a hot gun. But she's not who he thought she was. The heat was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down from a sky the color of bleached bone. It shimmered off the twin steel rails that sliced through the desert. Two lines of man's will stretching to an infinite horizon. And between them, lashed to a sun-warped railroad tie, was the girl. From his vantage point in the shimmering rocks above, the man with no name saw her not as a person first, but as an injustice. Her head was bowed, a cascade of raven-black hair hiding her face, her deerskin dress dark with sweat. Her stillness was a scream in the vast, silent emptiness of the plains. He saw the three men lounging by a small, smoky fire 50 yards away, their laughter brittle in the dry air. They were white men, and their prize was an Apache girl, a sacrifice to some private, worthless god of hatred or boredom. It was a scene as old as the blood-soaked dirt of the West, and for the man watching, it was a ghost story made real. He didn't make a conscious decision. The choice had been made years ago, in the ashes of a burned-out homestead with the smell of smoke in his nostrils and a silence where a child's laughter should have been. That failure was a brand on his soul. Now, seeing this, the old wound burned hotter than the sun. He slid back from the rock ledge, his movements fluid, economical. There was no anger on his face, only a profound and terrible weariness. He was a man paying a debt, and the currency was violence. His horse, a lean buckskin that had seen too many hard miles, nickered softly as he checked the loads in his colt. He whispered a quiet word, a promise of water and rest on the other side of this. Then he swung into the saddle. He didn't charge wildly. He moved with the predatory grace of a cougar, using a shallow arroyo to mask his approach until he was almost upon them. The first man looked up from his fire, mouth open to shout a warning that was swallowed by the roar of the colt. The bullet took him high in the chest, and he fell backward into the flames with a terrible hiss. The other two scrambled for their rifles, their drunken confidence vaporizing in the sudden, lethal reality. The nameless cowboy was a whirlwind of controlled fury. The second man managed to raise his rifle, but the cowboy's second shot was already on its way, punching a neat, dark hole through the man's gut. He collapsed, clutching his stomach, his surprise turning to agony. The third man, younger, terrified, dropped his weapon and threw his hands up. "Don't shoot! Please, mister! She's just a dirty patch!" The cowboy rode up until the muzzle of his colt was inches from the man's sweating face. The hammer was already cocked back, a sound like a cracking bone in the sudden quiet. The man's plea died in his throat, his eyes wide with the certainty of his own death. The cowboy's gaze was flat, empty, a mirror of the desert itself. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whimpering of the gut-shot man. "Get on your horse," the cowboy said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "Ride east. Don't look back. If I ever see your face again, I will kill you where you stand." The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled onto his horse, fumbling with the reins, and kicked the animal into a frantic gallop, disappearing in a cloud of his own dust. The cowboy dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't spare a glance for the dying man, whose moans were growing weaker. He walked to the railroad tracks, pulling a knife from his belt. He knelt before the girl. For the first time, he saw her up close. She was younger than he thought, maybe 18 or 19. Her face, when she finally lifted it, was stoic, her dark eyes holding a depth that startled him. There was no gratitude there. Not yet. Only a flicker of assessment. He worked the knife under the thick ropes, the fibers parting with a dry rasp. He expected tears, a collapse, some sign of her ordeal. Instead, as the last rope fell away. She simply pushed herself to her feet, her movements stiff but steady. She rubbed her wrists, her gaze sweeping over the scene, the two bodies, the departing rider, and him. She looked at him, at the smoking gun still in his hand, at the cold set of his jaw. He thought he was saving a helpless victim, an innocent sparrow left for the snake. But as he looked into her unblinking eyes, a sliver of doubt pricked him. He had just charged into hell for a stranger, and in the silence that followed, he had the unnerving feeling that she was the one who was taking his measure. The desert wind picked up, whispering secrets along the steel rails, and the man with no name realized his act of redemption might have just bought him a whole new kind of trouble. They rode north, away from the damning evidence of the tracks, the sun a relentless hammer at their backs. He had given her the waterskin first, watching as she drank sparingly, her movements measured, conserving. She rode the best of the dead men's horses, a sturdy roan, handling it with an easy familiarity that was the first crack in his assumptions. He expected to have to lead her, to guide a frightened, disoriented victim. Instead, she rode beside him, her posture erect, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land with a fluency he recognized as the mark of a true survivor. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as the dust their horses kicked up. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but this quiet was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. He had risked everything for her based on a simple, brutal equation: innocence versus evil. Now, the variable of her identity felt like an unknown quantity that could change the entire problem. "They call you anything?" he finally asked, his voice raw from disuse. She turned her head, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were the color of dark, wet earth after a rain. "Nita," she said. The name was simple, offered without context. "Nita," he repeated. He waited for more. A family name. A tribe. The Apache were a proud people. They did not abandon their own without cause. Was she Mescalero? Chiricahua? The information was vital. Her people might be looking for her, or they might be the ones who had left her there. A punishment for some transgression he couldn't begin to fathom. Knowing her tribe meant knowing if they were riding toward allies or another enemy. "Your people," he pressed, keeping his tone level. "What tribe?" A flicker of something, caution, perhaps, or defiance, passed through her eyes before being shuttered away. "I have no tribe," she said, her voice soft but firm. The answer settled like a stone in his gut. No tribe. That was impossible. It meant one of two things. Either she was an outcast, shamed and exiled for a crime so severe her people had erased her name, or she was lying. He didn't know which was worse. An outcast could bring the wrath of her former tribe down on them for harboring her. A liar, well, a liar could be anything. As the day bled into a bruised purple twilight, her value became undeniable. She spotted the faint green line of willows that marked a hidden creek he would have missed. While he watered the horses, she gathered edible roots with a practiced hand, her small knife moving with precision. She wasn't helpless. She was competent, resourceful, and deeply, unsettlingly self-contained. The deerskin dress he'd mistaken for simple Apache garb was, upon closer inspection, impeccably stitched, with subtle beadwork along the collar that spoke of time and care, not of a destitute wanderer. They made a cold camp in a rocky overhang, the darkness absolute, save for a sliver of moon. He took the first watch, the colt resting on his thigh. He watched her as she slept, her form a small bundle of blankets. The vulnerability he had seen at the tracks was gone, replaced by a resilience that was as unnerving as it was admirable. Who was this girl with no people? Why would those men, Common thugs, by the look of them. Take such a risk just to kill one Apache girl in such a ritualistic way. It didn't add up. The West was cruel, but its cruelty usually had a purpose: greed, land, revenge. This felt like something else, something personal. He remembered the look in her eyes when he'd cut her free. It wasn't the dazed gratitude of a rescued captive. It was the sharp, calculating look of someone whose plans had been violently interrupted. He had charged in, a blunt instrument of righteousness, to save the damsel from the dragon. But as the desert night deepened around them, cold and indifferent, Jedediah, a name he hadn't let himself think in years, couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't saved her from the story. He had just blundered his way into the middle of it. And Nita, the girl with no tribe, was holding the next chapter close to her chest, and he was now bound to her until she chose to let him read it. 3 days they rode, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the railroad. The landscape shifted from flat, sun-scorched plains to a broken country of mesas and canyons, the air thinning as they climbed. Nita remained an enigma. She spoke only when necessary, answering his questions with a frustrating economy of words. Yet her actions spoke volumes. She taught him to find water by watching the flight path of doves at dusk. She treated a cut on his horse's leg with a poultice of chewed leaves that stopped the swelling overnight. Jed found himself watching her, his initial pity replaced by a grudging respect that was fast becoming something more complicated. He was a man who understood the language of survival, and she was fluent. It was on the 4th morning that he knew they were being followed. It wasn't a feeling. It was a certainty. A flicker of misplaced light glinting off a spyglass from a distant ridge at dawn. A pattern of disturbed rocks that was too deliberate for a simple animal trail. These were not the signs of a vengeful Apache war party. War parties were loud. They wanted you to know they were coming, to taste the fear. This was different. This was the patient, methodical work of hunters. "We've got company," he said, not taking his eyes off their back trail. Nita didn't look alarmed. She simply stopped her horse and listened. Her head tilted slightly. "How many?" "2. Maybe 3. They're good," he conceded. "They've been on us since yesterday." Her jaw tightened. For the first time, he saw a crack in her stoic facade. It wasn't fear. It was a deep, weary anger. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice tight. "Faster isn't going to shake them," he countered. "Not in this terrain. We need to find a place to make a stand, or a place to disappear." He looked at her, his patience finally worn thin by the miles and the mystery. "I need to know who they are. Nita, this ain't about you being Apache, is it? Those men at the tracks, and these men now. They aren't after you for your blood." She stared at him, a silent battle waging in her dark eyes. The trust he had earned by saving her was now being weighed against a secret she was clearly willing to die for. The wind whistled through the canyons, a lonely, mournful sound. "They are bounty men," she finally whispered, the words seeming to cause her physical pain. The world shifted on its axis. Bounty men, not raiders, not tribesmen. Professionals, men who hunted for paper, for warrants and money. Men who didn't give up. "There's a price on your head?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You kill someone." "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "I have killed no one." "Then why?" he demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Why does a girl with no tribe have bounty hunters on her trail?" Before she could answer, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon, and a chip of rock exploded from the cliff face just inches from his head. Instinct took over. "Get down!" he yelled, shoving her from her horse and pulling her behind a cluster of giant boulders. The horses, spooked, scattered. A second shot whined over their heads, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness. Jed peered through a crack in the rocks. He could see them now. 2 men on a high ledge 1,000 yards away, rifles resting on the rock. They were too far for his Colt. It was a siege. "They have us pinned," he said, his mind racing. "They'll wait for us to run for the horses or die of thirst." He looked at Nita. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. She was looking around, not at the hunters, but at the rock formations surrounding them, her gaze analytical. "There," she said, pointing to a dark fissure in the canyon wall, almost completely obscured by a thick growth of desert scrub. A cave. A way through. He saw it then. It wasn't a solution, but it was a chance. A dark, unknown path. "Stay behind me," he ordered, pulling his Colt. They moved in a low crouch, the rock scraping their backs, the hunters' bullets pinging off the stone above them, each impact a deadly punctuation mark. They scrambled through the scrub and into the narrow opening, plunging from the blinding sun into a cool, damp darkness. The air inside was stale, ancient. As their eyes adjusted, they found themselves in a narrow passage that sloped deeper into the earth. They were safe from the rifles, but they were trapped. Their horses were gone, their water was low, and they were being hunted by men who were paid to be relentless. The simple act of cutting a girl free from a railroad track had led him here, into the belly of the earth, chained to a woman whose past carried a price in gold. And as he listened to the faint, triumphant shouts of the bounty men echoing from the canyon mouth, Jed knew that the truth, whatever it was the only thing that could buy their way out. The darkness in the cave was absolute, a thick velvety black that swallowed sound and sight. For hours, they sat in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the world outside. The bounty men were patient, their occasional calls echoing faintly down the passage. Then, the world changed. A low rumble began. A vibration felt deep in the stone around them. The temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and rain. A ferocious desert storm, born of the afternoon heat, broke upon the canyon with biblical fury. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting open, and a torrent of rain began to fall, turning the canyon floor into a muddy, raging river. They were safe from the hunters. But now they were prisoners of the storm. The water couldn't reach them deep in the passage, but the sheer, deafening violence of it isolated them completely. In the suffocating dark, Jed built a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub he'd had the foresight to grab on their way in. The tiny flames pushed back the oppressive blackness, casting their faces in a flickering, intimate light. The cave was bigger than they'd thought, a single, large chamber. In the shared, fragile glow, the walls between them began to crumble. "They won't be able to track us in the mud. Not for a day or two," he said, his voice low. It was the first thing either of them had said in hours. Nita nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. The firelight caught the exhaustion etched on her face. "It gives us time." "Time for the truth," he said softly, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact. All of it. He didn't wait for her. He looked into the small, dancing flames and began to speak, the words coming out rough and coated in the dust of years of silence. He told her about a small town in Kansas, about the marshal's badge he used to wear with pride. He told her about the Miller family, a farmer, his wife, and their 7-year-old daughter. Sarah, who had hair the color of corn silk. He told her about the Stanton gang, how they'd ridden into town while he was away on a prisoner transport he shouldn't have taken, how they'd burned the Miller homestead to the ground for a handful of dollars. "I got back to see the smoke," he said, his voice hollow. "I found them in the ashes. All of them. I was the law. I was supposed to protect them." He looked at his hands, as if he could still see the soot on them. I hunted down every last one of the Stantons. Took me a year, but it didn't change anything. It didn't bring them back. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain so old it had become a part of him. That's the ghost I carry. Nita. When I saw you on those tracks, I saw Sarah. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. The cave was silent, save for the fire's crackle and the distant roar of the storm. Nita watched him, her own eyes glistening in the firelight. Then, slowly, she shifted. She turned her shoulder toward the light and pulled down the collar of her deerskin dress. There, just above her collarbone, was a scar. It wasn't the jagged line of a knife or an arrow. It was a strange, puckered mark, a series of small concentric circles seared into her skin. It was ugly, alien, a brand of a different kind. I was 6 years old, she said, her voice a near whisper. My mother and I were visiting my father's world. There were machines everywhere, iron horses that breathed smoke. One of them had hot cinders falling from its belly. I thought they were shining stones. I reached for one. She traced the scar with her finger, her touch gentle. It doesn't hurt anymore, but I remember the smell. Burning metal and me. My father was furious, not because I was hurt, but because my mother had brought me there, where his important friends could see me. See us. She pulled her dress back into place, but the image of the scar remained, burned into Jed's mind. It was a piece of the puzzle he never could have imagined. Iron horses. A father from a world of machines. A world that would put a bounty on a girl to erase a connection. Her scar wasn't from the wild frontier. It was from the civilized world that was encroaching upon it. Their pains were different, born of different worlds, but they resonated with the same frequency of loss and injustice. He had lost his honor in ashes, and she had been branded by an iron world that refused to claim her. In the heart of the storm, trapped in the belly of the earth, the cowboy and the girl with no tribe were no longer just allies of convenience. They were two scarred souls who had found, in the telling of their pain, the first hint of a shared sanctuary. The storm passed as dawn broke, leaving the world washed clean and silent. A sliver of pale light found its way down the passage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The intimacy of their shared confessions the night before lingered in the quiet chamber. Jed looked at Nita, seeing her now not as a mystery to be solved, but as a story to be understood. The scar she carried was a key. Your father, he said, his voice gentle. He's a white man. Nita met his gaze without hesitation, the last of her walls gone. He is more than that, she said, and the bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. His name is Cornelius Thorne. Jed's blood ran cold. The name was a thunderclap. Cornelius Thorne. The Baron of the Rails. A man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and relentless ambition. Thorne was carving his empire across the West with steel and fire, a titan who bought politicians, crushed competitors, and moved armies with the stroke of a pen. To be Cornelius Thorne's enemy was to be an ant in the path of a locomotive. The men hunting you, he breathed, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. They work for him. He wants me dead, she confirmed, her voice flat. He has wanted me gone since the day I was born. But my mother, she protected me. She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress and pulled out a small, leather-bound object. It wasn't a map or a deed. It was a journal. Its cover worn, smooth with handling, the leather supple and dark. She opened it with a reverence that was almost holy. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping handwriting, interspersed with delicate drawings of plants and animals. My mother was called Anawa, Morning Star in her tongue, Nita said, her fingers tracing the script. She was the daughter of a Chiricahua chief. Thorne met her when he was surveying his first route through their lands. He was charmed by her. He saw her as an exotic prize. He made promises. He married her in the Apache way. She explained that Thorne, in his early, more vulnerable days, needed safe passage for his railroad. He signed an agreement, a treaty witnessed and recorded by Anawa in this very journal, in exchange for the right-of-way through a sacred valley. Thorne granted Anawa's people sole title to the surrounding lands, the Crimson Hills, in perpetuity, a promise written and signed in his own hand. My mother was smart, Nita continued, a flicker of fierce pride in her eyes. She knew his promises were smoke, but his signature was ink. She kept this journal as proof. As long as she lived, he honored the deal, if only to keep her quiet. But she died of a fever 2 years ago. And now, Thorne wants to run a new spur line directly through the Crimson Hills. The treaty is the only thing standing in his way. And I am the only one who knows it exists. It all made sense. The men at the tracks weren't random thugs. They were Thorne's men, sent to stage her death as just another bit of frontier violence. A nameless Apache girl killed by drifters. It would have been a perfect crime. Her existence erased, the journal buried with her. When Jed intervened, he turned a quiet assassination into a messy manhunt. The bounty was a cover, a way for Thorne to use legitimate channels to hunt down and silence his own daughter. Jed looked from the journal to Nita's face. She wasn't just a girl with a secret. She was the living embodiment of a promise her father wanted to break. She carried the blood of 2 worlds, the Chiricahua and the railroad, and she was being crushed between them. Her fight wasn't just for a piece of paper. It was for her mother's name, her people's future, and her own right to exist. He had set out to pay a debt for a ghost child in Kansas. He now found himself standing against an empire, beside a woman who was the heir to a legacy of love and betrayal. The choice before him was clear. He could walk away, ride back into the anonymous life of a drifter, and let Nita face the Titan alone. Or he could stand his ground, shoulder a burden far heavier than any he had ever known, and see this through to its bitter end. He looked at the journal, at the proof of a promise, and then at Nita, the proof of a legacy. The drifter in him wanted to run, but the marshal he used to be, the man who believed in justice, had already made his choice. The sun was high in the sky when they finally emerged from the cave, blinking against the sudden brightness. The world felt different now, the lines of battle clearly drawn. Jed looked at Nita, no longer a damsel he'd rescued, but a partner in a war he was now committed to fighting. The weariness in her eyes was still there, but it was overlaid with a new, steely resolve. "He won't stop," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "As long as I have this journal, his men will hunt me. Running is just a slower way to die." "Then we stop running," Jed replied, the words feeling right, solid, for the first time in years. He felt a sense of purpose that wasn't born of guilt, but of conviction. "We take the fight to him." A faint smile touched Nita's lips, the first he had ever seen. "You would do that? Stand against Cornelius Thorne, for me?" "I'm standing against a man who would tie his own daughter to a railroad track to save a few dollars on a land deal," he corrected her gently. "I'm standing for your mother's promise. Some things are worth fighting for." He thought of the Miller family, of the honor he'd thought he'd buried. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a better future. The dynamic between them shifted entirely. They were no longer a protector and his charge. They were an alliance. He had the tactical mind and the gun. She had the knowledge. Her father's ambition was now his greatest weakness. "He's building a new bridge," Nita said, her mind already working. "At a place called Crimson Pass. It's the gateway to the hills my mother's treaty protects. There's a dedication ceremony in 5 days. A senator from Washington is coming. Thorne will be there to personally drive the last golden spike. He needs to show the world that the territory is secure, that his path is clear. And if the proof that he doesn't own the land shows up at his own party," Jed finished, a grim smile on his face, "he'd be ruined. The senator would bolt. His investors would panic." "He knows," Nita said. "That's why he's desperate. Why he sent Kane." "Kane?" Jed asked. "The man leading the hunters," she explained. "He's Thorne's head of security. He's not a simple bounty man. He's loyal. And he's ruthless." The plan began to form, a desperate, audacious gamble. They couldn't fight Thorne's army, but they could use his own arrogance against him. They would go to Crimson Pass, but not to hide. They would go to force a confrontation, to expose the truth in the one place he couldn't afford a scandal. The decision made, a change came over Jedediah. He was no longer the nameless drifter. He meticulously cleaned his Colt and the rifle he'd taken from one of the dead men, his movements precise and economical. It was the ritual of the lawman he once was, preparing for a righteous fight. He was no longer running from his past. He was embracing the skills it had given him. Nita, too, seemed transformed. The weight of her secret, now shared, had been lifted, replaced by the burden of action. She guided them through the broken lands with a new urgency, her knowledge of the terrain their greatest asset. She was no longer a victim of her legacy. She was its champion. Their journey to Crimson Pass was a silent testament to their new bond. They moved as one, a team forged in violence and trust. He taught her how to reload his rifle swiftly, and she showed him how to use the reflection of a knife blade to signal across a canyon. He was the gun, and she was the guide. He was the anger, and she was the cause. They were two broken pieces of the West, a disgraced lawman and a disowned heir, riding together against a tyrant. And as the distant, skeletal frame of the Crimson Pass Bridge came into view, silhouetted against a blood-red sunset, Jed knew this was more than a fight for a piece of land. It was a fight for the soul of the West itself, a choice between the iron will of powerful men and the simple, unbreakable power of a promise made to a woman named Morning Star. Crimson Pass was a testament to Thorne's ego. A massive wooden trestle bridge spanned a chasm hundreds of feet deep, the raw timber stark against the ancient red rock. Below, a veritable army of workmen swarmed, preparing for the dedication. Banners bearing the name of the Thorne Continental Railway flapped in the wind. From a high wooded ridge, Jed and Nita watched the scene, the final stage for their desperate play. "He'll be on the observation platform," Nita said, pointing to a bunting-draped structure near the center of the bridge. "He loves an audience." "Kane and his men will be watching the crowds, not the cliffs," Jed strategized. "They're looking for a girl trying to sneak in, not two people already waiting for them." Their plan was simple, and that was its only strength. They would use the chaos of the dedication to create a diversion. Jed would draw Kane and his hunters into the rugged terrain below the bridge, while Nita, using a path known only to her people, would get to that platform and confront her father in front of the senator. The journal was her weapon, and the truth was her shield. As the special train carrying Thorne and his dignitaries chuffed into view, the plan went into motion. Jed fired a single shot into the air from the far side of the pass. It was the bait. As he expected, 3 men, led by a tall, grim-faced man he knew must be Kane, immediately broke away from the main security detail and headed toward the sound, moving with professional speed. Jed led them on a punishing chase through the rocks and gullies, a ghost they could never quite catch. He was back in his element, the terrain his ally, his movements fueled by years of hunting men. He separated them, using rock slides and narrow passages, taking them out one by one with cold, efficient precision. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a harvest. Meanwhile, Nita moved through the shadows. She descended the cliff face like a spirit, her deerskin blending into the rock, her feet sure on the ancient handholds of her ancestors. She emerged at the base of the bridge, a stone's throw from the platform where her father was now preening. Shaking hands with the portly senator, Jed finally cornered the last man, Kane. The confrontation happened in a small, dusty clearing. Kane was no simple gunman. He was fast, and he was smart. The two men circled each other, a silent duel of intent. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Drifter," Kane sneered, his gun held steady. "All for a half-breed girl. He's paying me more than she's worth." "Some debts aren't paid in gold," Jed said, his voice level. It was the marshal from Kansas who spoke, not the Drifter. The gunshots were nearly simultaneous. A searing pain tore through Jed's left arm, but his own shot was true. It struck Kane square in the chest, the force of it knocking the man off his feet. Kane looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, a look of pure surprise on his face, before he collapsed into the red dust. Jed clutched his bleeding arm, the pain sharp and clean. He had won. But it wasn't over. He looked up toward the bridge, high above. Nita had stepped onto the platform. A gasp went through the crowd. Cornelius Thorne turned, his face a mask of geniality that froze into disbelief and then twisted into pure fury when he saw her. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, trying to maintain control. "I am Nita, daughter of Anawa of the Chiricahua," she announced, her voice clear and strong, carrying over the stunned silence. She held up the journal. "And I hold the proof of a promise you made. This land you stand on is not yours to take." She opened the journal for the senator to see, pointing to Thorne's signature at the bottom of a page. The senator's face went from confusion to cold fury as he recognized the truth. The whispers started, a wave of scandal that would crash over Thorne's empire. Thorne, cornered and exposed, lunged for her, his face contorted in a snarl of hatred, but Jed was already there. He had climbed the scaffolding, his wounded arm screaming in protest, and vaulted onto the platform just behind Thorne. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood between Thorne and his daughter, a silent, immovable guardian. His presence, bloody and resolute, was a final damning piece of evidence. Cornelius Thorne looked from his daughter's defiant face to the cold eyes of the man who had undone him. He saw the law in Jed's gaze, a force more powerful than all his money and all his steel. He had lost. It was over. His legacy was not one of progress, but of a lie, now laid bare for all to see. Jed looked at Nita, who stood tall and proud, her mother's journal held against her heart. In her eyes, he didn't see a victim or a girl with no tribe. He saw a queen who had just reclaimed her kingdom. And in that moment, standing on the bridge of his enemy, his arm bleeding and his past finally at peace, Jedediah knew he had paid his debt. Redemption wasn't found in the vengeance of a gunslinger, but in the steadfast courage of a lawman who had finally, once again, protected the innocent. Weeks later, the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. Cornelius Thorne's empire was crippled, mired in Senate inquiries and withdrawn investments. The story of the railroad baron's secret Apache family and his treachery was a whispered legend from St. Louis to San Francisco. The Crimson Pass Bridge stood unfinished, a monument to a rich man's hubris. Jed and Nita stood on a high mesa overlooking the Crimson Hills. The land was vibrant, alive, untouched by steel. His arm was healing, bound in a clean sling she had fashioned. He no longer felt like a drifter, a man defined by a name he'd abandoned. He was just Jed, and that was enough. Nita was no longer the girl with no tribe. She was Anawa's daughter, the guardian of her people's future, a leader who had won her first and most important battle not with a weapon, but with the truth. She had offered him a place with her people, a home. He had not yet accepted, but he had not refused. The past could never be erased. The scar on her shoulder and the ghosts in his memory would always be a part of them. But they were no longer chains. They were reminders of the price of survival and the cost of honor. They had faced down the worst of the New West, its greed, its cruelty, its lies, and had answered with the best of the old, courage, loyalty, and a promise kept. They didn't speak. They stood together, watching the sun set, painting the hills in hues of gold and crimson. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and pine. It was a wind of change, a wind of peace. In the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West, fortunes were built and empires fell. But what truly endured, what the land itself remembered, was the quiet strength of two scarred souls who found their redemption not in vengeance, but in standing together against the encroaching darkness, a shared beacon of hope in the heart of the wild.